loose words. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need theatrics. You only needed silence and a mirror. Because nothing crushes a person faster than the confrontation of their own face stripped of illusions. You became the one thing they couldn't control, a witness they could not deceive. They spoke in rehearsed lines, and you listened without applause. They performed virtues they did not possess, and you blinked back no admiration. And in that blankness, in that sacred, heavy pause between their posturing and your stillness, they began to feel it. Not your judgment, their own. You didn't weaponize cruelty, you weaponized clarity. And clarity to the dishonest is more fatal than any blade. The mirror you held didn't distort, it didn't flatter. It showed the angles they spent lifetimes hiding. The cowardice under the pride, the betrayal under the kindness, the manipulation stitched beneath the jokes. You weren't cruel enough to shame them. You were merciful enough to reflect them as they truly were. And that, in itself, broke them more efficiently than rage ever could. Because rage gives them a story where they are the victim. Reflection gives them no such refuge. In the mirror you offered, they saw the villain wearing their smile. And once you've seen your own mask slip, you can never unsee it again. They despised the stillness of your gaze, the way you didn't flinch when the lies unraveled, the way you didn't rush to rescue their performance. In your silence, they saw the weight of all the things they could no longer deny. You gave them no out, no justification, no stage, just a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the architecture of their own self-betrayal. And what terrifies a manipulator more than being seen, not punished? Seen, without the usual buffer of charm, without the normal defenses of pity. Just seen, naked, under the spotlight of their own making. You became a ghost that lived not outside of them, but inside of them, a constant whisper at the edge of their conscience. Every time they tried to narrate their heroism, your mirror interrupted. Every time they tried to rewrite the ending, your silence sharpened the memory. They could block you, ignore you, smear you, but they could not unknown what you reflected. That is the horror they now carry, an internalized presence they can never expel. You didn't leave scars on their body. You left fractures in their narrative. And narratives, once fractured, bleed forever. People will tell you it's better to forgive and forget. That reflection is cruel. But understand this, when someone has spent their life depending on blindness, vision feels like violence. You didn't hurt them. You freed them from their lies. You gave them the rarest gift possible, the opportunity to face the consequences of their choices with open eyes. Whether they take that opportunity or drown in it is not your burden to carry. You are not responsible for the demons they meet when you turn on the light. You simply refuse to live in their darkness. And refusing darkness is not cruelty. It is self-respect. There's a special kind of loneliness reserved for those who weaponize appearances. You didn't have to exile them, they exiled themselves. From their integrity, from their own potential, because once the mirror cracks, they realize the applause they chased was hollow. The admiration they engineered was conditional. And in your absence, the noise fades. The crowd disperses, and they are left alone with the shallow echoes of their own fraudulence. You were never their opponent. You were their only anchor to reality. And now that you've cut the tether, they drift in a sea of their own fabrication. Their anger at you is not anger at betrayal. It is anger at exposure. You didn't change. You didn't suddenly grow fangs and claws. You simply stopped playing along. You stopped dimming your perception to soothe their ego. And in that act of quiet rebellion, you broke the spell. They hate you because you saw them, all of them. Not the curated image, not the charming mask, the desperate machinery underneath. And nothing enrages a fraud more than being recognized by someone who refuses to unsee the truth. They will tell stories about you, oh yes. They will call you bitter, unstable, cold. They will rewrite the script so they can remain protagonists in a tragedy of their own invention. But every time they speak your name, it will taste like regret. Because behind every accusation, there will linger the sharp sting of knowing you didn't destroy them. They did. You just stopped cushioning their descent. You let them experience the gravity of their own choices without a net. And that is a punishment far more sophisticated than any vengeance could ever design. And you? You walk away untouched. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. Seeing people you once rooted for reveal the rot they refused to cure. It wounds deeper than betrayal. But you didn't let it poison you. You didn't let it harden you. You took the pain, distilled it into wisdom, and built yourself anew. You were the architect of your survival. You turned the mirror inward too, polished your own shadows. Became so clear that no one else's distortion could blur your reflection again. You don't need their validation. You don't need their narrative. You are the living proof that survival does not require applause, it requires truth. They spent years building the persona. Every gesture calculated, every laugh rehearsed, every apology sculpted to perfection. The mask hardened into a second skin, so seamless that even they began to believe it was real. But masks are not made for eternity. They crack. And when you held up that mirror, still, merciless, indifferent, you triggered an implosion no applause could muffle. The persona they paraded and the reality they buried collided like tectonic plates grinding under centuries of pressure. And when identity fractures, it does not fall politely. It shatters with violence, with shame, with the unbearable realization that the facade they loved could not survive the brutal gravity of their own hidden truth. Inside them, the war began instantly. Persona screamed for survival. Reality demanded to be acknowledged. The louder the false self shouted, the more deafening the silence of the truth became. It clawed at them, in their sleep, in their solitude, in the middle of conversations they could no longer enjoy. You didn't need to attack. You didn't need to destroy. You simply exposed the fracture, and the architecture they depended on collapsed under the weight of its own contradiction. People who live by image cannot withstand confrontation with substance. They built glass castles and mistook them for fortresses. You brought no hammer, you only opened the curtains. The mind, when forced to recognize its own hypocrisy, reacts violently. First comes denial. They tell themselves you misunderstood, that you are bitter, wrong, jealous, because if you are wrong, they don't have to change. Then comes rage. You become the villain because vilifying you is easier than auditing their soul. After rage, fear sets in. The fear that if one person saw it, others might too. That fear festers, metastasizes. They become paranoid, defensive, exhausted from the effort of pretending the cracks are not spreading. Meanwhile, you've already moved on, unburdened, free. They carry the mirror you left behind everywhere now, etched into the back of their minds like a scar that no performance can cover. When you held up that mirror, you didn't offer interpretation, you didn't judge, you didn't narrate the reflection. That silence made it even worse. Because when people are confronted by truth, without commentary, they must supply the dialogue themselves. And they are far crueler narrators of their own downfall than any enemy could be. Their mind replays every deceit, every manipulation, every hollow gesture, and plays the scenes out in vivid detail, without mercy, because there is no buffer left, no applause to drown it out, no audience to rewrite it for. Just them, and the truth they thought they had buried so deep it would never resurrect. They will pretend they are fine, smile harder, laugh louder, post more, but look closely. There is a tremor in the smile, a glitch in the performance. They perform happiness now the way a prisoner sings about freedom, out of necessity, not belief. You didn't humiliate them publicly, you didn't drag them into battle. You simply let them see the abyss within themselves. And there is no deeper punishment than realizing you built your life atop a lie you can no longer unsee. That haunting does not scream, it whispers. It punctures peace with every silence they can no longer fill. You meanwhile continue, stronger, sharper, calmer. Because you did not need to win a war. You only needed to reclaim yourself. You didn't confront them to punish, you confronted to protect. To cut the cord between your destiny and their delusion. And in doing so, you became the reminder that not everyone will enable their illusions, that not every mirror will bend to flatter, that some mirrors, like yours, reflect without bias, without mercy, and without need for revenge. True power does not shout, it does not flail. True power reveals and walks away. Their internal implosion will not be swift. It will be a slow erosion. Every lie they told themselves will lose its flavor. Every shortcut they celebrated will turn to ash. Every mask they wore will feel heavier, and they will search for someone to blame, some new narrative that restores their comfort. But it will fail, because comfort built on fiction decays the moment truth breathes on it. And you breathed quietly, firmly, a single, unforgiving exhale. And now, every room they enter, every relationship they touch, every goal they chase, they will carry the fracture you illuminated. Understand this: holding up that mirror was not cruelty, it was inevitability. When you walk in truth, you cannot help but trigger the collapse of those who have hidden from theirs. You didn't need to wield the mirror as a weapon. You simply needed to be unshakable. Authenticity itself is a scalpel that cuts through artifice. Presence itself is a force that collapses projection. You did not set out to destroy. You set out to live honestly. They chose to build their identity on sand. You chose stone. The flood was always coming. You were just the first to notice the tide. You didn't need to sharpen a weapon. You didn't need to raise your voice. You didn't need to orchestrate their downfall with elaborate moves. You simply took off the rose-tinted glasses they tried to staple onto your face. You looked at them as they were, not as they advertised themselves to be. You withdrew the courtesy of illusions. You stopped editing the picture to protect their ego. And in that raw, unfiltered light, nature did the work no force could accelerate. Decay sets in quickly when the mask is peeled back. Corruption withers faster than it spreads when exposed to air. You didn't wage war against them. You released entropy. They thought their survival depended on dominance, on outplaying, outshining, outmaneuvering. But their real survival had always depended on secrecy, on carefully curated facades, on distraction. And when you simply refused to participate in their theater, refused to applaud mediocrity dressed as brilliance, refused to nod at betrayal camouflaged as charm, you stripped them of their camouflage. You left them standing alone in a battlefield they built. Their cries for mercy were not because you attacked. They cried because the invisible scaffolding they had depended on crumbled the moment you stopped pretending it was real. You didn't turn them into villains. You didn't frame them as monsters. They were already rotting underneath the surface. You just stopped shining a light in the direction they preferred. You stopped handing them a script they could memorize. You withdrew the narrative. You forced them to ad-lib. And when fraudulence is forced to improvise, it collapses. Their identity, unpracticed in truth, buckled under the simplest pressure, reality. They mistook your silence for cruelty. But silence is the purest form of indictment, when someone's entire existence depends on noise and misdirection. People like them are not destroyed by confrontation. They are destroyed by clarity. They thrive in confusion, in ambiguity, in false consensus. You did not give them a villain to rally against. You gave them a void where their masks fell flat. And that vacuum, that absence of control, it suffocated their persona faster than rage ever could. They self-imploded because the architecture of their deceit was never meant to bear the weight of unfiltered observation. You simply stepped back and watched as the edifice rotted and toppled under the pressure of its own lies. Nature always reclaims the fake, always. Lies are like paper castles in a hurricane. They can stand only in dead air. Truth, raw, sharp, undeniable, brings the wind. And you were the one who let the windows open. You didn't engineer the storm, you removed the shields, you removed the soft lighting, you removed the scripted applause. And nature, with its merciless beauty, rushed in to correct what they had corrupted. The collapse was not your revenge, it was the earth, reclaiming equilibrium. They felt the panic first in the way people stopped responding to the performance, in the way admiration dulled into awkward tolerance, in the way attention turned from applause to suspicion. The ecosystem they depended on began to die because you no longer fertilized it with blind acceptance. You were the oxygen they mistook for weakness. And once withdrawn, they discovered that without constant validation, their character wilted. You did not attack the tree. You simply stopped watering the illusion. And nature, left to her own brutal honesty, did what you were too merciful to do. They will blame you, of course. To survive the narrative collapse, they must have an enemy, because admitting that their downfall was self-inflicted would require a level of humility they never cultivated. They will say you abandoned them. They will say you changed. But what truly happened is far simpler. You stopped participating in their delusion. You handed them the keys to their own reality and watched them fumble, watched them sink into the very pit they dug with smiling hands. And you? You are not burdened by guilt. You are not marred by regret, because you understand nature's law. That which cannot survive the removal of illusion was never built to last. You didn't dismantle them, you exposed their lack of foundation. You didn't sabotage their future, you withdrew your scaffolding from their hollow present. You respected the truth more than you feared their rage. You honored your instincts more than you honored their performances. In that choice, that ruthless, sacred choice, is what separated you from them. They spent years layering themselves with subtle deceits, small edits to their personality here, quiet lies stitched into conversation there. Not grand falsehoods, but 1,000 micro-betrayals of the self, designed to win smiles, nods, invitations. They learned to curate their voice, their image, their pain. They fed on approval like moths fluttering around artificial light. And for a time, it worked. People clapped for the mask. They clapped loud, so loud that the mask hardened, convincing even the wearer it was real. But masks don't survive true reflection. When you stood there, unmoved, unblinking, refusing to bend the mirror for their comfort, the pressure of truth cracked every stitch they thought was permanent. You didn't call them out. You didn't mock them. You didn't tear them apart with words. No. Your gaze alone became the scalpel, silent, precise, deadly. Because real power does not need accusation, it only needs exposure. You watched the cracks spread across their constructed persona like fractures racing across thin ice. You saw it in the way their voice faltered mid-sentence, in the way they over-explained jokes that had always been automatic, in the way they blinked too fast, too often. Panic lives in the eyes before it touches the mouth. And you, with your merciless patience, made them feel seen in a way they were never built to survive. Every deception they crafted, the charming smile, the polished script, the carefully manicured anecdotes designed to hide the hollow underneath, turned to ash the second they realized they were not performing for an audience anymore. They were standing in a court of one. And you weren't interested in their entertainment. You weren't amused by their self-congratulations. You weren't even angry. You were indifferent to their illusions. And that crushed them faster than hatred ever could. Because hatred acknowledges power, indifference strips it away. Their minds scrambled to rebuild the illusion, even as it burned. They grasped for old tricks, humor, guilt, charm, but nothing stuck. You had seen too much. And once seen, certain fractures cannot be unseen. They knew, deep in the marrow of their being, that you would never again pretend. That every word they uttered from this moment forward would land on someone who knew the entire script was a lie. They were trapped. Not by you, by themselves. By the realization that without deception, their existence felt hollow, and with it, they were exposed. You didn't pity them. You didn't celebrate either. You simply observed, a force of nature disguised as a witness. And nature does not apologize for earthquakes, for floods, for storms. Neither did you. You let the truth breathe, and in doing so you suffocated the persona they had spent years constructing. Because deception, when seen and left unengaged, collapses under its own futility. Lies require validation to survive. They require a dance partner to sustain the illusion. You refused the dance. You became the silent refusal that pulled the oxygen from their fabricated fire. There is a unique kind of loneliness that descends when the lies no longer work. They felt it as soon as your gaze passed through them like light through stained glass. Not stopping, not clinging, just illuminating the fractures they could no longer repair. They could fake smiles for others. They could spin new tales for new crowds. But inside, the echo of your gaze followed them, a specter of the truth they tried to bury deeper with each new performance. But burial is no resurrection. Every shovel of falsehood only added weight to the corpse of the identity they pretended was alive. You taught them something they will never admit aloud. Survival through deception is not survival at all. It is slow-motion self-erasure. And now, every mask they wear feels heavier. Every compliment they fish for feels emptier. Every achievement they announce feels faker. Because once someone has seen you fully, without the makeup, without the script, without the spotlight, you can never truly believe in your performance again. In your quietest moments, that someone, somewhere, holds the unedited version of your soul and survived it without blinking. You learn that truth is heavier than lies, not because it demands violence, but because it demands endurance. Lies are fast and brittle, like paper weapons. Truth is slow and crushing, like gravity. You bore the weight of seeing clearly when others begged for distortion. You bore the loneliness of standing still while others danced into denial. And they called your refusal to kneel violence, because it reminded them of the prison they willingly built around themselves. You didn't swing a sword, you held a mirror. You didn't break them, you watched them break against themselves. You did not lose them, they lost themselves. You did not abandon them, you abandoned the fantasy. There is no cruelty in refusing to live in hallucination. You learn that truth is heavier than lies, not because it demands violence, but because it demands endurance. Lies are fast and brittle, like paper weapons. Truth is slow and crushing, like gravity. You bore the weight of seeing clearly when others begged for distortion. You bore the loneliness of standing still while others danced into denial. And they called your refusal to kneel violence, because it reminded them of the prison they willingly built around themselves. You didn't swing a sword, you held a mirror. You didn't break them, you watched them break against themselves. When you exposed the truth, you didn't do it to punish. You did it to breathe, to reclaim air poisoned by too many lies told too beautifully for too long. You did it because suffocating on falsehoods is the slowest death. You chose life. You chose painful clarity over pretty deception, and they hated you for it because they could no longer pretend that survival required only consensus. You proved that survival, real survival, demands confrontation with the unedited self, and confrontation, to those who live by performance, feels like execution. They wanted you to apologize for surviving the blast radius of their lies. They wanted you to repent for not rebuilding the burning house they set ablaze. They wanted you to wear guilt like a scarlet letter because your resilience shamed their fragility. But you owe them nothing. You did not start the fire, you did not pour the gasoline. You merely refused to roast marshmallows while the structure collapsed. You walked away from the pyre without mourning the ashes of things that were never real to begin with. Understand, exposing the truth demands sacrifice. You sacrificed belonging. You sacrificed comfort. You sacrificed the cheap security of being liked over being authentic. You chose the sword over the kiss. And the sword is heavier, sharper, lonelier. But it is also cleaner. You can look at yourself without flinching. You can sit in silence without drowning. They, meanwhile, will spend years trying to scrub the mirror clean, never realizing it is not the mirror that is dirty, it is the reflection they no longer have the strength to embrace. You did not lose them. They lost themselves. You did not abandon them. You abandoned the fantasy. There is no cruelty in refusing to live in hallucination. There is no violence in breathing clean air after years spent inhaling secondhand delusions. If they choose to remain angry, let them. If they choose to call your clarity a betrayal, let them. Their rage is a confession. Every insult they hurl at you is an admission. You dared to look where they refused to glance. And survival in the new world, the real world, belongs to those who can look truth in the eye without weeping. You are not their villain. You are their consequence. You are the price of neglected authenticity. You are the fine print they ignored when they signed the contract of deception. Let them call you cold. Let them call you merciless. You know what you are, honest enough to survive the burning of false empires. You didn't wage war. You didn't declare battle. You simply stepped into the light and refused to apologize for the shadows it revealed, and they, unable to withstand their own exposure, called your existence an act of aggression. And you walk forward, not bitter, not broken, free, because you understand the secret they could never bear to face. Truth is the final violence, the only one that wounds to heal, destroys to rebuild, burns to bless. And you, in refusing to flinch, in refusing to edit your gaze, became the storm they will never outrun.